the week of Memorial Week, it even feels like more of an honor to do this podcast with you, Oak. Why don't you, for those who may not know you, go ahead and just give us kind of that history, where you're at currently, and really what you want the future to look like. Give us that rundown, because I know why I should listen to you, but for anybody who doesn't know.
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul, and thanks for having me on the show. I've been looking forward to this since the first time we spoke, and connected on LinkedIn. I am a retired lieutenant colonel. I did 23 years on active duty. I grew up in northern Illinois, so I'm a Midwest boy. Grew up working in a small farm town of 1,200 people. And when I say everybody knew everybody, I mean everybody knew everybody. When I do something wrong 4 blocks from my house, by the time I got to my house, somebody had already called my parents. I mean, everybody knew everybody in this town. I played baseball, basketball, football through my childhood and through high school, and I played baseball in college. And then when I graduated from high school, spent 2 years at the United States Military Academy. I did not graduate from there, but I spent 2 years there. Then I came home, helped my father run his business for about 18 months when he wasn't feeling very well. And then I went to Northern Illinois and I finished up in ROTC and played ball through college, and met my wife at NIU because she was in the Army ROTC program as well. She's an Army nurse, or was, for 8 years. That was 38 years ago, so I think that worked out okay for me. And then got my commission, spent 5 years as an infantry officer, 18 years as an armored cavalry officer. My deployments were Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Bosnia, Kosovo, and I did a couple hurricane relief operations, one for Hugo in Charleston and one for Andrew here in Florida. And then retired from the Army, ran a food bank for a couple years. Great experience, learned a lot during that time. And then I did my last 13 years of working for somebody else as a Department of the Army civilian here at Embry-Riddle in Daytona Beach, recruiting for Army ROTC. I published my book in February 2021, and since then, I've been out on the speaking circuit talking about leadership and success, how to build effective and efficient teams, lead through change. I've got a bunch of things I can talk about. And that's really my passion right now, is to get out and talk to as many people as I can. And I do a lot of conferences, a lot of association conferences, but I also do companies. I'm doing a company, year-long leadership development program for a company in California in June. I think we have to do a better job creating this next generation of leaders. And that I look at it that as my passion, as my responsibility. You know, I live right here in Daytona Beach, Florida. I've got my yacht, my 17-foot John boat with a 40 horsepower engine. I don't go anywhere near the ocean. I fish back in the mangroves and the creeks. And my fishing buddy said, "Oak, what are you doing? Why are you flying all over the world talking?" He said, "Why don't you just retire and fish every day?" And I said, "I can't. I look at it as my responsibility to pass some of these lessons that I've learned over the last 40 years onto this next generation of leaders."
I love that. One of the fallacies I think a lot of people fall into is the idea that retirement is this fun thing. And I'm not saying it's not, but what I love about what you said, and your book is very good. You talked about we need to do a better job at preparing the future leaders. And I love also that you just kind of glanced over the fact that you've been married 38 years and did all of this very super successful stuff. And it's only less than 6 minutes into the podcast. The first question I had was, you said we need to do a better job at preparing the future leaders. So as you kind of reflect on all those experiences, being married to your wife 38 years, graduating RFTC, recruiting soldiers, as you had shared, what would you say of all that? We'll kind of start with this question. Has had the most significant impact? And what I mean by that is, what made your approach different from other leaders, as you say, as we kind of reverse engineer what good leadership looks like?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I was lucky. I've had some great leaders in my life that some decided to be a mentor to me. I'm not sure why, but they did. They took an interest in me, and that had a huge impact in my life. But even in high school, I think back to when I was in high school and I had, besides my father was, I am who I am today because of my father, no doubt about that, good or bad. But in high school, I had two great mentors who were servant leaders who understood it wasn't about them. It was about helping to create good young men and women who were going to be good husbands, good wives, good fathers, good mothers, productive members of society. My history teacher, Mr. Charles Schindler, who I stayed in contact up to about 18 months ago when he passed away. And then my high school basketball coach, Coach Terry Nidzwicki, who I still stay in contact with today. And they understood it wasn't about them. You could go into their office anytime, sit down, and no matter what your problem was, if you spelled it out for them, they would give you some advice. They'd help you work through it. And that made a big difference in my life. It started me on that servant leadership path. And then I had some great leaders in the Army. I also had some horrible leaders in the Army, but I had some great leaders in the Army who were servant leaders and showed me that that's the way to get the most out of people, to help create, to make them better people, which then makes them better soldiers or workers if you're not in the military,
Yeah.
that then gives you the best of them in your organization. And if they come and give their best, then your organization's going to be better and you're going to be successful at whatever you do. So I've been very lucky throughout my life that I've had some good servant leaders who have taught me that it is about the other people. I've had my hand in commissioning over 600 lieutenants for the United States Army and leaders for this Army and the country. And I used to tell every single one of them from the lessons I've learned over 40 years. Being a leader is about servant leadership. It's about selfless service. It is not about you, and yet it's all about you. It's not about
Right.
you and the titles you get or the privileges you get or that you're going to get better pay and live in a nicer house and drive a nicer car. Okay, leaders get those things
Yeah.
generally, and that's okay as long as that's not the only reason you want to be the leader. If that's the only reason you want to be the leader, please go do something else because you're not going to be a good one. It's all about you and how you treat and empower the people and the organization that you have the privilege to lead. And it is a privilege. And unfortunately, what I see today is too many leaders in every profession all around the world have forgotten that it is a privilege to lead. And that's my message, is trying to remind people that it's not about you and yet it's all about you.
Yeah, I remember that. I was reading that in your book. It's not all about you, it's all about you. You mentioned a couple key common denominators. You referenced your history teacher, some people in the military. So if I heard you correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, one common denominator was that it's about the other person. So let's take this, let's frame it from this approach. If I
Okay.
gave you a blank canvas and I said, hey, here are the non negotiable core competencies that, in your experience, leading and being very successful as you are, Oak, what would be some of those non negotiable core competencies? Like you're building the perfect team.
Yeah.
This has to be ingrained. This has to be on the mission statement. This has to be on the pyramid of success, whatever that may look like for you. What are some of those? Because one of those you've already said, which is it's got to be about someone else. It's got to be about them first. If not, get out the game. Is there anything else you could speak to if we frame it from that perspective that you're also like, this is a non negotiable?
I think integrity and character,
Okay.
those two go hand in hand because people want to be led by better people than they are. I believe that 100%.
Okay.
And you need to set that example for them day in and day out in everything you do. In your work life, in your personal life, you need to be that example. When I ran my Army ROTC program at the University of South Alabama, where I was creating that next generation, that was my first real job of creating the next generation of leaders from scratch. Brought in high school graduates, had them for 4 years. I only had them for 3 years, but 3 of their 4 years in ROTC, trying to get them ready to be leaders, not only in the Army, but in the country, because a lot of people leave the Army after their bare minimum time and they take all that knowledge, skills, and ability out into the civilian world, which is a great thing. In Mobile, Alabama, not a whole lot of Army officers there.
Yeah.
And a lot of my friends would say, what do you really do? What's your job? And I said, my job is to create leaders. And the way I see that is that I need to set the example for them every single day. Show them how a leader walks and talks and dress and interacts with people every day. Make them want to be like me. And I took that to heart. And every single day, I tried to set that example for them. I think I did that throughout my career, but
Yeah.
certainly when I was dealing with young men and women who I was trying to create that next generation of leaders with. So I think setting the example in integrity, character, how you act, all those things are important. And tied directly to that is personal courage. Because without personal courage, integrity and character become pretty hard. Because that
Mm.
first opportunity, that first time when you're faced with a situation where what is easy rather than what's right,
Right.
and if you don't have the personal courage to stand up and do what's right, even when it's not in your best interest, because
Mm.
sometimes, we've all been there, leaders who have to make a decision and it's not in my best interest, but it's in the best interest of the organization or people in my organization. If you don't have personal courage to stand up and make that choice, then you're not going to. You're going to take the easier wrong rather than the harder right. And so I think those three things are tied together. And then I think the last piece that really has to be there is empathy. And I think many people today have the wrong idea of what empathy is.
Okay.
Empathy doesn't mean you let people do whatever they want. It means that you understand why they're in the situation they are, or the decisions that they got to make, or the things they got to do because of where they are in their life. And I
Right.
think leaders have a responsibility of not only making better workers and better leaders, but better people. And the only way you're going to do that is to make yourself available as a mentor, as a counselor, as somebody to bounce ideas off of, to give advice, whatever that looks like for that other person. You need to
Yeah.
make yourself available as a leader to do that. And I don't see a whole lot of leaders doing that today.
So that kind of brings me to a question I had thought of. You've seen a lot of different situations. Undoubtedly, problems are going to come up. Okay. Problems where people will not align with those non negotiable skills, those critical things like empathy, as you had touched. When you are faced, in your experience, with a challenge, what is your approach to trying to redirect or bring them back to center? Because I know for me personally, like I'm like this certified. I've done thousands of sales consultations, and there's just sometimes, even in my line of work, and this isn't the same. I'm just using this as a lateral example. There's just that guy or that girl or whatever who, man, no matter what it feels like, no matter how much coaching or self development I do, it's just not working. And that's kind of a vortex question, but I'm trying to extract from your success what could be done better. How have you approached major problems where you're like, you know what I did, even though it seemed hopeless and it worked? Could you kind of speak to me from that lens and how you
Right.
overcome problems and leverage your leadership skills and experience to bring people back to center to those core competencies that are
Yeah,
non-negotiables to make
absolutely.
a strong team?
Absolutely. And the first thing I always tell people is you got to be careful about your first impression. And I use this great example. I had a young man my first year in ROTC, running that ROTC program. I had a young man who showed up and on paper was fantastic. When he got there, he was very shy. He stood up away from everybody, wasn't engaged. And I thought, the first week, I thought, yeah, this young man's never going to make it. But he kept coming back. He kept learning the things that we were teaching him. He was doing the things we told him he needed to do to become a good leader. And about second semester sophomore year, I saw the light bulb go off. And he started to figure out all the things, tying all the things we were teaching him together to start becoming a good leader. That young man ended up being the cadet battalion commander for the battalion.
Oh
I
wow.
mean, he was, and he's now, I think he's on the lieutenant colonel's list to be a lieutenant colonel in the Army. So obviously he had the right things. He just didn't know he did. So be careful with your first impression because it's not always right.
Mm.
I believe you should have a first impression of people,
Yeah.
and that's just human nature, but always just give them time because you never know. But when I run into somebody who's not meeting the standard, whatever that standard is, first of all, you have to tell them that because
Yeah.
they may not know that they're not meeting the standard, that they're not doing the things you're asking them to do or want them to do. And if you don't tell them, then that's your fault, not theirs. So what I do generally is I say, okay, I'll call somebody in and we'll sit down and I'll say, okay, here's the standard. Here's what you need to be doing. And here's where you are. And here's the difference between a leader and a boss. A boss says you're not meeting the standard, fix
Mm.
it, and walks away. A leader, a good leader, says you're not meeting the standard. Here's what the standard, here's where you are, and this is how we are going to fix it. And then you sit down with that person and you come up with a plan, whether it's a month long, 3 months long, 6 months long, a year long, however long you think it needs to be.
Right.
You and that person sit down and figure out a plan on how to get them to the standard. And then, every so often, whatever you determine, you call them into the office and say, oh, and you pull out that list of things that you and that person decided need to be done to get them to standard. And then you start checking things off. Okay, we've done this, we've done that. We haven't done this yet. You're still not meeting the standard here. And you work through it like that. And my view is this: after that period of time, whatever time that is, you and that person decide they need to meet the standard. If they still aren't meeting the standard at that point, it's time for them to leave. They have self selected not to be in the program, not to work for me, whatever. I've given them every opportunity and a lot of my time to help get them there. And they chose not to take advantage of that. And at that point, I got no problems cutting people loose.
You mentioned earlier that the light bulb moment went up for that very successful individual who you had the opportunity that, I don't know, would you say misdiagnosed may be the right term? And if
Sure.
not, you can correct me. I have no ego. I just want to get better. What does it look like, in your opinion, when you said the light bulb went up? Can you kind of speak to some specifics on what that means? Is it that he was knowing the answers to questions? Is it that he was staying later? Is it that he, I don't know, called you after 8 and said he read a book? I'm not sure. I'm just kind of I'm trying to
Yeah.
to kind of scratch that itch a little more when you had
Yeah.
mentioned that light bulb.
Yeah, I think that comes in many different ways,
Yeah.
and I even see it when I'm giving my keynote talk. You can just see it in their eyes. You can see it in their reaction when I say something that then they understand. Yeah, I either don't do that well and I need to, or I do that. Because I've had people come up to me after reading my book or my keynote talk, and they'd say, I never really considered myself a leader until I heard you talk or I read your book, and I realized I'm doing all those things because you don't need a title to be a leader. I'm a firm believer of that. You could be a leader without having the title. But but this young man started doing the things that we were talking about that made a leader. Started volunteering to be a leader
Mm.
for different events, different things that were going on in the organization. Taking interest in other cadets, junior cadets, and helping them to understand that there is a rhyme to the reason. If you just keep working along, you'll figure it out at some point that yeah, this all makes sense, and there's a reason why we do what we do. And he just became more involved and more active in the program, and you could just see it, just his reaction, how he acted, how he interacted with other people, just was a huge jump from when he first got there.
Awesome. I love that. If someone were to describe your leadership in a sentence, and I think a lot when I read this book, your leadership legacy, and this might be an interesting question for you to answer. If someone was to describe your leadership in one sentence, what would you hope that would be when you walked away? Like, you're not saying it, but what would be that unique value proposition to what your leadership style is, even when someone's not looking? I don't know. And that's kind of a tough question,
Yeah.
but you're a tough guy. So I feel you can. I can challenge you, and you can obviously handle it.
Yeah. So I hope that people would describe me as a selfless leader. That
Right.
I don't take my, and much to the chagrin of my wife many times, I don't take my interest into it at all. I step back and I say, what's the best interest of the organization? What's the best interest of the people or that person if it's an individual? And I think that's the key to being a servant leader is, you got to take care of yourself. You got, mentally, physically, you got to do
Yeah.
all those things because you can't give from an empty glass. You got to make sure that you are do the things you got to do to stay healthy, be motivated, all those things. But that is in addition to what your job is as a leader.
Yeah.
And my book, Your Leadership Legacy, people ask me all the time. Obviously, leadership mean or legacy means something to you. So what does it mean to you? And that, to piggyback back off what you just asked about what I hope people remember me as a leader. I think, legacy is very important as a leader. And I don't think a lot of leaders today think about what their legacy is going to be. And I always explain it this way. I think legacy has two parts. A very small part is what you actually accomplished in your organization. Now, that does matter.
Mm.
In the real world, results do matter. Maybe in fantasy
Right.
land where everybody's a winner and everybody gets a trophy, maybe not. But in the real world where we actually live and work, results do matter. So about 20% of your legacy is that. And the reason I tell people that that's a small part is because when you leave, and you are going to leave, I don't care what job you have, one way or
Yeah.
another, you are leaving. You're either going to quit, you're going to get fired, you're going to retire, you're going to die. One way or another, you're leaving that job. Somebody else comes in, and when they take over and change everything, then what's your legacy?
Right.
It's their legacy. So your legacy is really that next
I like
generation
that.
of leaders that you helped create, because they're going to lead in the way you taught them, I hope in selfless service. And so and then even more part of your legacy is then that they're going to create the next generation of leaders in the way that you've taught them, and they'll create the next one. And that's your legacy, that legacy of leadership that you've passed on. In that way, you're affecting not only that organization but the world, helping to produce that next generation and the next generation and the next generation. And that really became cemented to me. I always believed that, but when it really hit home to me, when I was running that Army ROTC program at University of South Alabama, I had somebody who worked for me, and I say he worked for me. He was probably a better leader than I was, Master Sergeant David Powell. And we were sitting there talking one day about the significance of what we were doing, helping to create that next generation of leaders, not only for the Army, but for the nation. And he said to me, he looked over at me and he said, sir, great leadership handed down from generation to generation is what develops great nations. And I thought, wow, what a powerful quote. I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't.
Yeah.
And the most
Yeah.
powerful part of that quote is that you can take that word nations
Yeah.
and you can substitute anything you want for it: a company, a university, a hospital, a food bank. It doesn't matter, because
Mm.
every organization in every profession needs good leadership if it's going to be successful. And I think that that's the key. That's what I hope people remember me as as a selfless servant who took care of other people, and that I helped create that next generation of leaders.
I love that. That's really good. Who's a better leader, you or your wife?
My wife, by far.
I was waiting to see how long it would take you to answer. Sorry.
My wife is probably a much better leader than I am. No
No,
doubt about it.
I that wasn't on my list. You've just been married 38 years, and I wanted to see. Okay, I need to. If anybody ever asked me that, I know I need to say it faster than you. Is what I was challenging
Yeah.
myself with.
Yeah,
So
well,
what?
and I don't just say that because it's the right thing to say. I believe it. I mean, I take a lot of counsel from my wife. I
Okay.
will ask her opinion on a lot of things, and have throughout my career. I'd come home and say, "What do you think of this?"
Yeah.
And I took her advice seriously. I didn't always do what she thought, but I always took it into account because I do have a lot of respect for her as a leader, not only in the family. She does did a lot of it in the family because I was gone a lot of the time, deployed
Yeah.
here and there, doing things. So people tell me your son and your daughter turned out great. I said, yeah, give her credit for that because I was gone so much. But also outside, she was an army nurse. She's done other jobs throughout her outside the house, and she's always steps up and does a great job in a whatever leadership role, either by title or just something that needs to be done. She'll step up and do it. So
Yeah.
that's a great question, and I think most good leaders have a good spouse behind them that they can
Mhm.
bounce ideas off of. In the book and in my talk, I talk about Napoleon and his corporal and how he
Yeah.
understood that you got to have that person to bounce ideas off of, or else you're going to do something dumb.
Absolutely. What's a small gesture you've learned you believe has kind of an outside impact? And maybe it's something you learned from your wife that kind of helps you lead better. What are some of those small gestures that maybe you learned from your wife? Because you mentioned her, you mentioned she's a better leader, or any other reference you want to pull in that helps create that impact. Because I do believe like small changes make huge impacts, especially on the subject of
Absolutely.
leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the thing that I think if somebody asked me, if you could go back, what's one thing that you wish you had learned
Yeah.
earlier in your career as a leader? And it's easy for me. I mean,
Yeah.
not a doubt. And both my wife and a lieutenant colonel that I worked for, who eventually retired, a 3-star general, and who became a mentor of mine for whatever reason. And they both taught me this lesson, different times and in different ways. And it's about listening to people,
Mm.
active listening, really listening, not just listening enough that you can say what you want to say, but actually listening to people and hearing what they're saying. And the first time it happened to me, I was a captain, and I had transferred from Fort Knox, Kentucky to Fort Irwin, California. And I got there and I'm walking down the hallway and my boss, this lieutenant colonel,
Yeah.
I'm passing him in the hallway and he says, "Oak, how are you doing today?" And I said, "Fine." And I kept walking. And he said, "No, no, no, no. Come back here." He said, "I want to know how you're doing. How's the move going? I know you're moving, you're just getting into the community. Any problems, any issues? How's your wife and kids doing with the move?"
Oh, wow.
And he knew my wife's name. He knew my kids' name and asked me questions about them. And I thought I was special. I thought, it felt like we sat there and talked for probably about 30 minutes. We actually probably talked for about 10 or 15 minutes. And I
Yeah.
thought I was special. He's taken an interest in me until about a week later, I heard him doing the same thing with another captain outside in the hallway.
Oh,
But during that time, I mean, he was a
yeah.
busy man. And during that
Yeah.
time, not once did I see him look down at his watch like he had somewhere better to be.
Mm.
At that point, I was the most important thing on his schedule for his day. And that that was 1995. So
Yeah.
that's how long that stuck in my memory. And I said to
Wow.
myself, I remember how that made me feel. I want to make sure I make other people feel that way. And then the other time that really cemented it for me, my wife, again, who was 8 years in the army, we are never late for anything. If anything, we're that couple that shows up 15 minutes beforehand. So we were getting ready to go somewhere, and my wife said, "You ready to go?" And I said, "Well, that's about 5 minutes before we actually need to leave." And she said, "What?
Yeah.
But we might run into somebody in the elevator or in the lobby or in the garage that just needs to talk to somebody. And we
Yeah.
need to make ourselves available for that." And it's happened,
Yeah.
and you've run into those
I
people
love
that
that.
they just need to talk to somebody that day. You need to make yourself available to let them air out whatever it is they need to talk about. And so the thing that I think really makes a great leader is that listening ability to actually listen. And that's something
Yeah.
we don't do well, not only as leaders, but as people, not only in this country, but probably everywhere in the world. We just don't understand the importance of listening.
I love that you talked about making yourself available in case somebody needs you or just has a conversation. And I'll be honest with you, Oak, I have been guilty of not wanting to hear someone's problem, not because I don't care on some level, it's because like there's this thought in my head that says like I'm not qualified, like maybe they need a therapist, like that's if I'm being sincere with you. And I say that to say when I look at the landscape of the current generation and I look at how AI has like it's crazy how much priority that has taken, despite the fact it takes 17 times more power. I look at the importance on technology, not the importance on individuality in people. I think it's really important what you said. And I think I didn't plan this question. When you look at the landscape and you look at the priority of technology, you look at AI, you look at all this stuff in the news, what of that to you is noise? And what do we need to cut through to make sure we don't lose ourselves? We don't lose our leadership skills. We don't lose those key essentials because we don't want AI to steal from us. We don't want email to steal from us. It's kind of an odd word salad I just gave you. But what do we
Yeah.
need to cut through with all that to get to the heart of what really matters and
Yeah.
elevating people and prioritizing them?
That's a great question, Paul. So the way I look at AI and email and text and these things, smartphones,
Yeah.
it is a tool. It's a tool that we need to learn how to use and that we need to use in our leadership ability. But leadership, just like humanity, is about people and trust. And so the only way you're going to build trust with people is to interact with them in a way, in a personal way, in a manner that, and we can do that over technology. We
Yeah.
can like Zoom. We connected a month
Yeah.
ago or whenever it was we first connected. We connected over LinkedIn. You can use technology to help start that connection, but as a leader, you got to have that one-on-one personal relationship. I got it. You got to keep the leader-led relationship. There is
Yeah.
a line there that you don't cross, and I got that. That doesn't mean that you don't get to know people, that you
Mm.
shouldn't get to know people. And in fact, I tell one of the piece of pieces of advice that I've given every leader or somebody who wanted to be a leader since the time I started helping develop leaders is that your one of your number one goals every day should be to go out and find one person in your organization. If you can do it for 10, good for you. You got time, great. But
Yeah.
at least one, find one person and find out one new thing about that person. And
Mm.
not about work, their personal life. What's their spouse's name? What's their kid's name? What sports do their kids play? What's their hobbies? What do they like? What don't they like? Find out one new thing every day about one person in your organization because that
Mm.
starts building that trust. The opposite side of that I always remind people is if you're asking somebody that and expect them to answer, then you need to be willing to answer something personal about
Right.
yourself back to them. But
Yeah.
it's that personal interaction that helps build that relationship, that trust, the things that are needed for a leader. Not only the trust that the people you lead trust you, but you trust them. Human nature is we don't trust people we don't know very well.
Yeah.
So, which is probably a good thing. So the only way you're going to build that trust is to you
Yeah.
get to know them and let them get to know you. And then everybody in your organization has to have that attitude as well, that they want to get to know the other people in their organization so they can start trusting them. But it starts with you as the leader.
I remember hearing once knowledge is the ability to know something, wisdom is the ability to act. And I think sometimes for me, I have been guilty of being knowledgeable but not wise. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. Past experience in my is my assumption is the main reason why people don't do that very important thing you said of just asking someone one new thing. And I love that and I forget about that a lot, me personally. So I know we're coming down to the wire. And I want to first say thank you so far. This has been very strong. And, when I was driving door to door and doing all that more heavily in Miami, conversations like this helped me to get through all the rejection. to get through all the negative noise, we'll call it. What is one moment? You can just pick one. You can pick more than one if you feel inclined to, Oak. That best captures what leadership means to you. A moment that comes top of mind that you're like, you know what? That right there, that was leadership.
Yeah.
Black and white. You can't negotiate with it. You can't criticize it. The best example you can think of.
Yeah, that's easy. Absolutely, it's easy. I was captain. I was a senior first lieutenant, just ready to make captain, and I was working in the Cav squadron at Fort Stewart, Georgia. And we had an operations officer, and I was in the operations office. I worked in the operations officer office. I wrote operations orders,
Yeah.
telling organizations in our organization what to do, what they're going to do over the next whatever time frame. The operations officer, a major that I worked for, was one of those guys that if I'm in the office, you are in the office. I
Mm.
don't care if you don't have anything to do. If I'm in the office, you're going to be in the office. And this guy was unmarried and he stayed in the office till 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. And so we're all just in the office, three of us, three lieutenants who do this, we're doing the same job. And so we were just making busy work. Just, we had to be there. So we were doing stuff, but nothing that was a priority.
Mm.
And he finally left and the new major came in. And the very first day, I'm sitting there in the office. It's 5 o'clock, and I'm working on something that's due a month from now, 3 weeks, a month from now, because I figured I got to be there. I might as well do some work.
Yeah.
And at 5 o'clock, this new major walks up to my door in where my office is, and he says, sticks his head around the corner, and he says, "Oak, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm working on this operations order." And he said, "Is it due tomorrow?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Then go home. Spend time with your family." And he did that for everybody in that office. He walked up to him and asked them what they were doing. And he was the last one out of the office and he locked the door. He made sure everybody had left.
Wow.
And so when I became an operations officer in Germany, 20, however many, 15 years later, the very first day that I took over as the operations officer, I called all my people together and I said, "Look, there are times when I'm going to need you to be here till 9 o'clock at night. And if I do, then I will ask you to be here or tell you to be here till 9 o'clock, till we get whatever has to be done is done.
Right.
Unless I tell you that you need to be here past 5 o'clock, you need to go home at 5 o'clock and do whatever it is you do at home. And I don't want to know what that is, but don't do it here. At 5 o'clock, you leave and you go somewhere else unless I specifically tell you that I need you to stay."
Mm.
And that's the impact that had on me.
Mm. 20 years later, it still resonated with you.
Yeah.
Heard you correctly.
I remember that like it was yesterday. I really do.
Well, first off, well, last off, this has been probably one of my favorite podcasts. I've always had a huge reverence for the military. I've reported to military leaders, and this has just been an awesome podcast for me. So, what I want to give some CTAs 100%, obviously, is to follow you. Any CTAs you want to call to actions.
The thing I always like to tell people, because I'll show up at an organization and I'm going to speak about leadership, and somebody will say, "Well, Oak, you know a lot about leadership in the military, but you know nothing about leadership in my profession." And I'm like, "Are you kidding me? Leadership is leadership. I don't care where you practiced it. I don't care where you learned it. It is transferable from one job, one profession to another.
Yeah.
It is about people and trust. End of story, period." And if you realize that if you take care of people and you build trust, that you can lead any organization. And I've proved that. I've proven it. I went from being a combat arms officer to leading a food bank. You don't get any different than that. That's 180
Yeah.
degrees difference. And I was very successful at it because the principles of leadership do not change. How you communicate them and how you implement them may change from profession to profession, but the principles of leadership do not change.
That's true. I love that. There's so much value in this podcast. And when people listen to this, I don't want them to just click the link. I'm going to ask you guys to follow Oak because I think you should pick up his book, Your Leadership Legacy. I think you should follow him because I know I've got a lot of value in our short time together. And I want to again thank you so much for doing this podcast with me. It really has been an honor for me, sir, to do this with you. And I look forward to sharing this because I think there's so much in this short time together that if people just take 30% of it, they're going to see some major impact over the next 30 days and then some. That's my opinion, sir.